A few years ago, I think this was about 8 or 9, probably 9 years ago, I had a wedding to go to in Myrtle Beach. And for anyone who's been to a wedding in probably the last 15 or 20 years or so, they're pretty intense affairs. I would imagine there's a number of people in this building right now, in the sanctuary right now, who know that. If you're family or friends with the bride and groom especially, boy, do those get intense. Do those get busy. You're going to be asked to help out a lot. You're going to have a lot of dinners and brunches and breakfasts and lunches to go to, various other family functions to attend. They just get crazy. The business of a wedding can quickly take on a life of its own if you're not careful. The day of the wedding, though, I was actually invited to pause for a second, to kind of take a moment to step out of the wedding experience and consider some other things, to consider some higher things. This wedding was happening in Myrtle Beach, and we were at a big hotel, a multi-floor hotel for the wedding ceremony. And I was up with my family kind of high up in the reception space where we were going to be having the ceremony itself. This was probably, 10, 15 floors up. It was a big hotel. And I'd been talking with my family, with people for a while. I'm kind of circulating through the crowd, kind of saying hello to everyone, sharpening my pastoral instincts, as it were, before I had even an inkling that this was what I wanted to do. But, I'm walking around and I'm saying hi to everyone, and I finally have a moment to just kind of pause. And as I do so, I look out the window. Now, this is one of those, it's December, okay, so it's cold and it's not quite rainy, but it's definitely dreary outside. We are at the beach, but it's dreary outside, and this is one of those large panel kind of, probably about 6 feet by 10 feet kind of windows, so it's a pretty large space. And I just kind of let my eyes casually drift over towards the window. And do you know what I saw? I saw exactly what you would think. I saw the ocean. I saw the sand give way to the water. And I saw the water stretch on into the distance, and I saw the water give way to the horizon, and I saw off in the distance clouds that seemed so far away that if I swam for a day, I wouldn't touch them. I saw this massive open expanse completely free of people, no human development, no ships, no boats, no swimmers, just open water as far as I could see, and the horizon stretching out behind that. And I have to tell you, this was a powerful thing to see for me. It was stirring, it was emotionally evocative, it was charged, it was rich, it was amazing to sort of behold the awesomeness and the grandeur and the majesty of the world in which we live. And as I looked out, there was just a moment there where I thought to myself, you know what? I think I get why those old explorers would take the risk of getting in their boats and sailing off into the misty unknown for months and months and months at a time. I felt like for a brief moment I understood the romance of the open ocean. I felt like I understood the spectacle of charging off into that great unknown and waiting to see what might come. Now, today I have to acknowledge, as I've told this story, that you know what? We don't always think that way. And we don't always have opportunities to think that way. Most of us don't spend much time thinking about the unknown, looking off into the unknown, searching the unknown, looking ahead of ourselves. We like to spend our time in the known, don't we? If we're being honest, that's where we prefer to spend most of our time. We like being where it's safe. We like being where we know what our routine is. We like being where we know that things are going to be settled. We like stability. We like order. We like a well-maintained day. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. Most of us, I think, while we're there, while our feet are planted firmly in the known, we try to be good people. We try to do what we think is right. We try to take care of our friends and our neighbors and our family. Today we meet someone who in that regard is very much like us. Joseph seems like just a good guy, just a really solid guy. A good man, a decent man, a kind man, a man raised to abide by the conventions of the time in which he lived and the place in which he lived, and someone who did his best to do that. Someone who was raised well and tried to honor the way that his parents raised him. A man raised to revere the Torah and to respect its commands, to try to live his life compassionately. And this man follows a pretty ordinary track. He grows up, and he's set to be wed to a woman named Mary. So, of course, they're all off, I'm sure, planning the floral arrangements and reserving spots and checking in with caterers and trying to figure out how to set everything up, how to get everything ready for the service. And then Joseph learns of something that would seem to upend his entire plan. Joseph learns that Mary is pregnant. There are a lot of different ways, if you step back and think about it, that Joseph could have responded to this information. He could have been mean. He could have gotten angry. He could have been bitter. But if you step back and think about it, Joseph does something that I think we'd all consider extraordinarily gracious, given the time in which he lives. Without knowing how his betrothed came to be pregnant, and believing in his heart that God would no longer allow him to marry her, Joseph decides to divorce her quietly. Joseph doesn't act out of anger. Joseph's first priority is not accusing Mary of infidelity, nor hunting down some mysterious and we know non-existent other man. Joseph's first priority in this relationship remains what it has always been. Joseph wants to protect Mary, to honor Mary, to ensure Mary's security and social standing. Of all the choices that he could have made, Joseph chooses to respond to this uncomfortable and awkward situation by being faithful to God and by recognizing that his God is a compassionate God as well as a just God. Now, if I were to tell all of you that you did something faithful, something kind, something compassionate, something that recognizes God's twin commitments to justice and mercy, you might think that you had earned some kind of blessing with God, right? Do a little good to get a little good. We've all heard that before. We've heard that kind of idea, right? And if you believed in that thought, you might think that Joseph had earned himself some special consideration with God, some feather to place in his proverbial cap. But friends, that's not what happens. As a child, I believed in the power of the dollar. I was a convicted believer that 100 cents could get you far in life. And by that I mean that I had $1, one single dollar, and I believed that I could make a difference in the world with this $1, or at least that I could use it to get the stuff that I want. The reason why I believed this is because our school had a vending machine. And pretty much all that I wanted at that juncture in my life, the one thing I wanted but couldn't have, were things like Hostess cakes and Snickers bars and peanut butter crackers. Without $1, I had no access to any of that. With $1, with that $1 in my hands, I could get snacks from the vending machine. I was a man rich in the blessings that mattered. And I delighted every time I found my way to $1, every time someone would give me $1 for helping out around the house or doing something that I was supposed to do, being a good kid. I would light up at the thought that the next day when I was at school, that Hostess cake would be mine. It would belong to me, and I would be able to eat it. Now, anyone who's ever used a vending machine knows what's coming next. Because most of the time I got my Hostess cake. Most of the time I ate my Hostess cake. And sometimes I would put my dollar in that machine. I would punch in the numbers for the Hostess cake. I would watch as that little metal spiral wire wound down. I would watch as the Hostess cake fell into the slot, and I would watch as it got caught on some other part of the machine, never to be tasted by me. The horror. The horror. The horror. Do you know what, friends? If you step back and think about it, those days in which I lost my Hostess cake, those days in which my 12 and 13-year-old self would go on to class emotionally devastated, that I no longer possessed the wealth of the world, that I no longer possessed the bountiful creation that God had given us, that I no longer possessed the joy of that wonderful combination of chocolate and cream. Those days when I went to class feeling that way were actually a really helpful education on the nature of faith and the nature of God and the nature of human life. Because you see, good deeds are not currency by which we can purchase blessings. Not for ourselves and not for everyone else. Joseph's efforts to do a good thing are not responded to. He does not get a blessing. He does not get something neat, something new. He does not receive a one-to-one correlation for what he's done. Joseph's efforts to do a good thing simply become a part of the larger story that God is trying to write here. Through an angel, God informs Joseph that he should make Mary his wife after all, that he should put aside these plans that he had, because Mary, as it turns out, is not faithless, nor is she the victim of a violent crime. Mary has been chosen to become the means by which God will enter the world as a person, as a human being. Mary's body will become the site of a miracle, and through that miracle, God will save God's people once and for all. Joseph's role in this story is not to receive a blessing, at least not right away. Joseph's role in this story is to do the hard thing, the uncomfortable thing, the thing that might expose him to stigma and to judgment. Joseph's role in this story is to stay and to commit himself to being a part of this great story that God is writing. Joseph's good deeds have not brought him a new blessing. They have not brought him a commensurate good thing that he can now pick up and carry around with himself. They have merely kept him in position to play the role that he was always meant to play. And though little ink is spilled on Joseph in the Bible, at least comparatively, that role carries with it a huge responsibility. And that responsibility is something that Joseph must choose here and now to embrace. We all know this, that Scripture is full of stories of people who don't do what they're supposed to do, people who don't act how they're supposed to act, and Joseph could have easily been one of them. It would have been perfectly and understandably human for Joseph to chalk up this dream from the angel as a delusion, to tell himself he'd done enough already, he'd sacrificed enough already, and to go forward with his plans to divorce Mary. He could have done that, and logically speaking, it probably would have made sense. But that one choice would have irrevocably changed the gospel story. We all know what happens after Jesus' birth. We all know that even as Jesus is being proclaimed King of the Judeans, King of the Jews, that there is another man who claims that title for himself, and his name is Herod. We all know that Herod is jealous of his crown. We all know that Herod wishes to protect his crown, and we all know that Herod is willing to go to just about any length to protect it, including murdering children. Because in the coming days, Herod will send his agents out into his kingdom to murder all the infants that he can find. And if Joseph hadn't been there to listen to an angel telling him, pick up your family and move to Egypt, Jesus would have been among that number too. There is no gospel without Joseph making that choice. There is no gospel without Joseph choosing to listen to that angel. Which means that here and now, in this moment that we have encountered today, in this moment in which we find ourselves, there may well be no gospel without this choice, without this moment, without this decision that Joseph makes to commit himself, in spite of the fact that he has already extended himself forward in grace and compassion. God has asked him to step forward once again. So much hangs on his choice. And Joseph must decide whether or not to trust that God has bigger plans for him than he previously knew. In the Bible, blessings are not promised directly. They're often expressed as an indirect result of people doing what they are supposed to do, people doing what God has asked them to do. One act of faith does not carry with it the promise of one blessing. One act of faith needs to be followed by another act of faith, and another act of faith, and another act of faith, as we carry on playing our roles in this story into which God has drawn us. This is what life looks like out in the spiritual unknown that we call Christianity. This is what life looks like out in the open water, away from creature comforts and security. And in a few years, when Jesus begins his ministry and when his followers begin to congregate around him, this is what the life of a disciple will demand. Disciples will be people who trust in the word of angels, even when those words don't seem to make much sense. Disciples are people who believe that impossible things can happen. Disciples are people who do not settle for something less than full faithfulness, who are always striving onward and upward in the way that they can, not necessarily to do more, but to be more. This is what the life of a disciple demands, that we venture out into the unknown together, into the space where nothing is guaranteed except that God will be there. Or perhaps I should say this. The unknown is the place where nothing is guaranteed. Accept that God will be there. And by going forward into the unknown, by taking these risks, we are guaranteed a place in the greatest story ever told. In the greatest, most consequential, most epic, most grand, most important thing that has ever happened ever. It is because Joseph takes a chance, Joseph makes a gamble, that he becomes a key player within Jesus' story of salvation and redemption. So why did Joseph take this chance? Why did Joseph take this risk? Perhaps it's because he still recognizes and he still believes that the God whose mighty deeds are recounted in the Torah is still, was still, and will ever be still here with us now. Still believes that the God who created the world, the God who parted the Red Sea, the God who settled Israel, the God who watched over God's people all across the world, was still at work and could still make amazing things happen. And as the gospel testifies, Joseph's faith is rewarded. Joseph gets to be a part of this incredible story and gets to reap the blessings that come with that. The baby boy that he welcomes, the baby boy that we all will welcome, is the fulfillment of anything and everything that any of us could ever want, could ever hope for. He is hope completed. He is joy triumphant. He is love victorious. And that is who we follow when we claim the title disciple. This is the reward for Joseph. This is the reward for discipleship. This is the reward for stepping away from the shore and daring to claim your called place within God's great story.
Amen.
Christ's birth is now just a few days away. And today we have one last Sunday, one final opportunity to decide what that means. Will we allow the worship of our hearts to become one concern among many? Or will we commit to this great, big adventure that is in front of us? As Christmas Day nears, as we prepare to fill the manger, as we prepare to welcome the baby Jesus into our midst, into our church, and into our hearts, let us sail off into the unknown together. And as God leads us forward, may we trust that amazing things will happen again around us, within us, and through us. Friends, let us go and chase the horizon together.
Amen.
Amen.